Did you know that self-awareness is the most important and yet most misunderstood leadership skill? Did you know that most executives as a whole are less self-aware than any of the leaders who report to them? Nervous laughter erupts, right? And here is the most surprising phenomenon I've uncovered. Did you know that many of the most commonly accepted methods or tools for increasing self-awareness, not only do they not work, sometimes they can harm our self-knowledge? Are you surprised? No? One person is not surprised. I've got to tell you, I was. And I'm going to be sharing as much of my research as I can in the time we have allotted today. But first things first, the topic of this conference is the new talent economy. And all of you are spending all of this time and energy and mental space thinking about how you're going to take all of these principles back to your organization. What I want to argue is that you also deserve some self-development. If you think about the increasing importance that each and every one of you plays in your company, it's great, right? But with that increased importance comes increased pressure. So I think you deserve it. And what I want to challenge you to do is to sort of forget about that world out there. Everything will be as we left it in 60 minutes, and really think about using this time for you, for your growth and development as a leader. Sound fair? Awesome, okay. So let's start with a very basic definition. As you'll see, self-awareness is actually a little more complicated definitionally than it seems. But here's what my research team and I use. The definition is understanding who we are and how we're seen. Who we are and how we're seen. Now, I would go so far as to call self-awareness the meta skill of the 21st century. The meta skill, what does that mean? Researchers for many years, including myself, but many, many others, have found that people who are self-aware, and for our purposes, leaders who are self-aware, are happier, they make better decisions, they have better relationships. At work, they are higher performers who get more promotions. At home, they raise more mature children, they have better marriages. And there's even evidence that self-aware leaders actually lead more profitable companies. Very interesting stuff. But I would guess that none of you in this room are surprised. I have some fellow self-awareness geeks, right? Here's what I want you to think about, though, that might be a little bit new. Self-awareness is the meta skill because it essentially sets the upper limit for every other skill we need in the 21st century to be successful. Things like collaboration, influence, communication, emotional intelligence. And so we can only be as good at those things as we are self-aware. So last year, you guys had an incredibly impressive winner of the CLO of the Year, Audrey Masonet-Morales. And I was reading this article about her, and it just came sort of screaming out at me. She said that the three characteristics that talent leaders need: an innovative mindset, business acumen, and relationship building. And I saw those, and immediately it became clear that self-awareness was underlying them, right? For innovation, we have to understand what our assumptions are. We have to see how we're seeing things. For business acumen, those of us that maybe didn't grow up with a P&L have to know what we know and what we don't know. And then finally, relationship building, obviously, we need to know how other people see us and the impression we're making on them. So that's why I'm so passionate about this topic. And as I mentioned earlier, I've spent the last 4 years almost delving into this topic. And it's so incredibly important, but I think you'll see quite a few surprises. But before I go into all of that, I just wanted to say something about self-awareness as a construct in our world. How many of you have read an article at some point on self-awareness? Okay, almost every single person in this room. And that's great, right? But what I was starting to notice was that it was full of platitudes out there. They would say, well, be more self-aware, or we're not very self-aware, or get more feedback, or reflect on yourself. But to me, none of those sort of theories had been empirically tested. And that's what my research team and I have been working on. So we analyzed over 800 studies. 800 studies. We've surveyed thousands of people all around the world. And most importantly, I think, we identified people who didn't start out as self-aware, but who made dramatic transformations, radical improvements in their self-awareness. And the idea behind this, of course, is these people are going to be able to tell us what they're doing differently now, as opposed to people that naturally, sort of have self-aware qualities. So you're going to learn what some of these, as we call them, unicorns, have taught us. So here, I don't know what's happening with my clicker, but here are the takeaways for today. We're going to bust through some hidden barriers. You're going to learn sort of where you stand, might not be where you think. We're going to learn the myths and the building blocks of self-awareness, and then just a quick primer on how leaders build self-aware teams. Does that sound good to everyone? So let's do a little bit of an experiment. If we're talking about self-awareness, the first thing we should do is think about who? Ourselves, our own level of self-awareness. So we're going to do a little exercise. You can see up there 3 different categories. I'm going to flash 3 different roles that you play in your life on the screen. And what I want you to do, very quickly, using your gut, is to self-assess. Are you below average on that thing? Are you average on that thing? Or are you above average? Make sense? All right. We'll start with an easy one, HR knowledge. How many of you have average HR knowledge? A couple of you? Okay, 20% or so. What about below average? You're very enthusiastic to raise your hand. What about above average? Okay, yeah, quite a few people. Good. So you see the idea. Now we're going to get a little more personal. What kind of a friend are you? How many of you are average friends? Okay, what about below average? Sometimes I feel that way. I'm on planes so often. What about above average? There we go. See, look around the room. Last but not least, this one gets contentious. What kind of a driver are you? How many of you are content to say that you're an average driver? Okay, a couple of you. What about below average? Almost no one. One person in the back. What about above average? Yeah. So look around. What's happening here? As it turns out, this effect that we've just witnessed is not unique to the people in this room. Psychologists have identified something that they've dubbed the above average effect. And what does that mean? Well, it means that generally human beings think that we are smarter, better communicators, better friends, better drivers, and yes, better leaders than we objectively are. Now, I know that no one in this room falls in that category. But you might know someone who does. How many of you have met one of these people? Or worked for one of these people? Or dated one of these people? Horror stories abound, right? So these unself-aware people are just sort of walking around amongst the rest of us. Now, here's the question. What percentage of people do you guys think believe they're self-aware? Any guesses? 80%? As you'll see, that's low. 95% of people, according to our research, think that they are self-aware. What's the next question? How many actually are? Any guesses on this? 2035, oh, I would love that world. I would love to live in that world. Wouldn't it be great? Here's the truth. Here's where we're at right now. 10 to 15%. You know what this means, don't you? On a good day, 80% of us are lying to ourselves about whether we're lying to ourselves. So this is a huge issue, right? And we see it everywhere. Now, for you as leaders, and particularly as executives, it's even more difficult. I mentioned earlier that as a whole, executives are more likely to overvalue their skills and contributions. Why is that? Thankfully, we don't start out any less self-aware when we're on the executive track. But what happens over time with every promotion you get, you're more visible, the standards for success are more complex, and people are less likely to tell you the truth. And so over time, this creates an effect where, on average, executives are the least connected with sort of who they are and how they're showing up. Again, the good news is this is completely learnable, it's completely addressable, and we just have to find the right tools. But there's one more factor that I didn't mention that's part of these barriers to self-awareness, is I call it the cult of self. And in the cult of self, we are basically being tempted as a society to become more self-absorbed and less self-aware. You think about our kids. We give kids ribbons for anything nowadays. What would it look like for adults, I wonder? So the cult of self is recruiting you. It might have even been successful in having you join it. And very often, we don't see the sum total of these effects over time. So here's the first barrier. The barrier that we're going to talk about today, there are many others, is this feeling that we're already self-aware. Now, if I were sitting in the audience 4.5 years ago, here's what I would be thinking. I'd be sitting in my chair, looking around and going like, well, these people have a lot of work to do. Good thing I'm actually self-aware. But I have news for us. We all have work to do. And I'll just tell you a quick story. The irony of this is palpable. So I'm in the middle of my self-awareness research program. I think that I'm just learning all of this, and I'm like, yeah, maybe I am self-aware. So one night, my husband and I, and about 6 of his friends, who are now my friends, were out to dinner. And we were having a great time. I was the designated driver, so I was having a different great time, but I was still having fun. And we decided to go to a bar. And the background on all of these friends is, so I've been dating my husband 10 years. We've been married 8 years. They've become my friends too. So we go into the bar, and I'm just having this moment of like, God, I love these people. They're the best. We sit down. We put our sort of high-top tables together. And my friend Teresa, who's very merry at that point, at about 11:30, she kind of walks up to me and sits down, and she says, Tasha, I'm so glad that Dave brought you into our lives all of those years ago. And I thought, oh, that's so nice. And before I could even respond, she continued, and she said, and I quote, and boy, have you come a long way since we first met you. In the middle of a self-awareness research program. I have no idea what she's talking about. So I sort of had this, choice in life. I had 2 roads diverging. One was to change the subject and hope she wouldn't remember. But I felt a professional obligation to delve into this, what is she even talking about? So I'll spare you the finer details. But apparently, when I first met my husband at work and all of his friends, I was a little high maintenance. And I thought, what does that mean? So I asked her, and she said, well, maybe you should ask Dave. And I said, oh, okay. So we're driving home. I'm in the driver's seat. He's in the passenger seat. And I shared this with him, and I said, do you have any thoughts? Silence. And then very meekly, he goes, is this a trick question? I said, no, Dave, just tell me, lay it on me. And he gave me a couple of examples, and I started to understand where everyone was coming from. There was one in particular that is worth sharing just because I think it illustrates how different our behavior is perceived sometimes than we intend. So I started working in a Fortune 500 company after I graduated from grad school, and I had a kind of a manager level role, and every other person at my level had a hard-walled office. But they had run out of hard-walled offices in the office at the time. So what did they give me? A cube. And I thought, this is a quest for justice and fairness and truth, right? And so I advocated, and they finally put me in a hard-walled office. And my husband said, I know what you were trying to do there, but that's not how it came across. And I think we all have those things, well-intentioned actions that can come off completely differently. So this brings me to our first takeaway. Our first takeaway is simple. It's a mindset. It's to gently stop assuming that we're already self-aware. Not in a self-loathing way, not in a way that's going to sap our sort of self-confidence, but in a way that allows us to curiously and openly examine ourselves and the world around us. So that's the first takeaway. Now that we're armed with some evidence of the barriers, and at least a way to overcome one of the big ones, I want to delve down into what is self-awareness exactly and get us to some of these myths. So I said earlier, the definition of self-awareness is understanding who we are and how we're seen. And as it turns out, those two things are unique and independent types of self-knowledge. This is what our research has discovered. So on one hand, there's something called internal self-awareness. And that is kind of what most of us think about when we hear that term, right? It's introspecting. It's knowing what we want, what we value, what we want to accomplish. But at the same time, there's this thing called external self-awareness. Sometimes people mean this when they're talking about self-awareness, this idea that we have to understand how other people see us. So does that make sense, internal and external? I mentioned earlier that they're independent skills. And I don't know about you guys, but I found that really shocking. I assumed that if you were self-aware, right, you would be high in both. And that turned out to be the right assumption. But the assumption that didn't hold water was that if you were high on one, you would automatically be high on the other. So we psychologists love to break things down into 2x2 matrices, so this is a good opportunity to do that. So you can see here, external self-awareness is what? Yep, right, exactly. So how other people see us. Internal self-awareness is how we see ourselves. Okay, great. So on the bottom left-hand sort of portion, we have what I call seekers. These are people who are just starting their self-awareness journey. The thing that might help you discover if you're a seeker, even if you sort of don't know, is if you feel stuck, if you feel frustrated, if you're trying to launch a new initiative at work and you're just not getting the traction you want. Very often, it can be a result of not really knowing where you stand and not understanding the impact you're having on other people. But again, there's nowhere to go but up in this case. So part of it is recognizing where you are. This is where it gets a little more interesting. Everyone has this friend who is totally in touch with themselves and very excited to brag about it to us. They might go on mindfulness meditation retreats or spend, thousands of dollars a year on therapy. Or in the business world, they read every book that Harvard Business Review publishes, and they're quite proud of their level of clarity with themselves. There's just one problem. Other people see this person completely differently than how they see themselves. So if you're an introspector, you've already done a lot of the work, but what you need to work on in order to be a leader that more people will follow is understanding how you're seen and the impact you have on others. The next is the pleaser. And pleasers are the opposite. Pleasers are high in external self-awareness and low on internal self-awareness. And what this looks like on a daily basis is we're so focused on how other people see us that we're not taking the time to clarify who it is we are or what it is we want. And so pleasers are challenged because they don't behave authentically. And the reason is very often they put other people's needs and opinions above their own. Last but not least, we have the aware leaders. Aware leaders are easy to follow. They're people who stand for something, who know what they're about, who have clear goals. They understand their patterns of behavior across situations. And they have a curious and open view for external information from others. And what's interesting about truly self-aware people is they bounce those two things off of each other. They never take their opinion to be of greater weight than others and vice versa. It's all data to be curiously managed. So I want you, is everyone sitting at a table with at least one other person? Maybe, do you want to move to this table for this? Or do it in a second. So what I want you to do is say hello to your new best friend who's sitting next to you. And what I want you to do is just very quickly, literally in 1 minute or less each, I want you to share with your new best friend where you think you fall on this spectrum and how do you know. Does that make sense? All right, so I'll give you just a couple of minutes. So this isn't something we normally do. We don't sit here and examine these two factors. And so I think the clarity that they present give us a lot of opportunity to just curiously examine where we stand. Now, what's the problem here? Why are you not the person who can dictate where you fall? Yeah, because external self-awareness is knowing how other people see you. So the great irony is if you have room to improve, you're not necessarily going to know it. So this is just the beginning of the process, to think about where you fall and which of the two types of self-awareness you could stand to improve more. And the reason I had you do that exercise was, A, it was interesting, hopefully, but B, we're going to go over a couple of myths and tools for internal and external self-awareness. So you can listen especially closely to the one you think you might be able to improve more. So let's start with internal self-awareness. Our research has shown, and this is through the surveys of thousands and thousands of people, that there are basically 7 types of self-knowledge that self-aware people possess internally. And I'll go through them quickly. They know what are the principles by which they want to live their lives, their values. They know what they love to do, their passions, what makes them jump out of bed in the morning. They understand their aspirations. What is it that they want to achieve and to experience in their lives? Fit. This is about knowing the environment that's going to make us happy and that's going to be as stress-free as possible for us. Our patterns is our personality, right? It's our consistent pattern of behavior over time. Our reactions. This one's a little more complicated, but for our purposes, just think about it as knowing your strengths and weaknesses. And then last but not least is our impact. And this one is the impact that we have on others. So again, this is just a good diagnostic to say, where am I at internally? So how do we get to these 7 pillars of insight? How do we develop this type of self-knowledge? Well, conventional wisdom would dictate that you create some time. Maybe you go walk out on Huntington Beach or drive up and down the highway, and you just think. You examine yourself. You self-reflect. You introspect. How many of you believe that to be true? I certainly did. It was the surest thing I knew about self-awareness, was that people who self-reflect will be more internally self-aware. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Time and time again, researchers have found that self-reflection, not only is it not related to self-awareness, sometimes it's the opposite. So the more we reflect, the less self-aware we are. You might not believe me. If I were sitting here in this audience, again, I'd say, prove it. There is a lot to this, and I want to give you one example that might hammer it home. And so think about the most common question we ask ourselves when we're trying to get internal self-awareness. Let's say you didn't get a promotion that you wanted. How would you go about introspecting? Think about the questions that you might ask yourself. So think about one question just in your mind that you might ask yourself to figure out this situation. How many of you had the word why? Very good amount of you. What other words did you guys have? What? Is that what you're saying? Good. Okay. So that's actually a really interesting dichotomy. Most audiences that I talk to, I hear why, like screamed out. And so it's interesting to me to hear that from you guys. It makes me wonder if you've read some of this research, in which case I say good on you. This is the most harmful myth, in my opinion, about self-awareness, is that if we just ask ourselves why, we'll automatically get to insight. So let me tell you just briefly about why that assumption doesn't hold. So if we go back to our promotion example, if I say, why didn't I get this promotion? What that's likely to do is to send me looking backwards in my life for an explanation from my past. And so I might go way back. I might go back to my childhood and say, well, the reason I didn't get this promotion is I remember when I was 5, my mom gave me too many chores to do, and I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't juggle competing priorities, and that's probably why I didn't get this promotion. A couple things are wrong with that. Number one, that type of thinking sucks us into an abyss of self-loathing and self-scrutiny in a way that the research has shown makes us more depressed and more paralyzed to move forward. The second reason that's dangerous is there's been a lot of work showing that no matter how hard we try, we cannot unearth our subconscious thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And so we might find an answer that seems right, but it might not be the actual answer. So what, not why, is the tool that I want to give you just briefly. Instead of, in that promotion example, asking, why didn't I get the promotion? If I ask what questions, it'll be a lot more productive. So if I say, what do I need to do differently in the future to get the next promotion? Or what skills was I missing? Or what feedback do I need to get from the people around me to better understand this decision? So do you see how that works? One small word change can be the difference between getting sucked into our baggage and moving forward with future and with purpose and generally more productive thinking. So external self-awareness. How many of you wanted to work on this? Okay. Yeah, so about half of you. That's reflective of most of the audiences I see. So the shadow you're casting as a leader is so important to understand. But for each of you as executives, it's hard to get that data on a regular basis. And we talked about why that is. So for now, for those of you that really want to work on this, the first question I would ask is, who around you are you confident is telling you the truth? And if you're like a lot of other executives, the answer is not a lot of people. Certainly speaking truth to power can be incredibly difficult, but we also know that there are lots of things humans will do. We'll do pretty much anything to avoid giving someone bad feedback or bad news. And one example I talk about in my book, does anyone know who this is? This is Ed Catmull. Ed Catmull was very famously Steve Jobs' mentor, and he founded Pixar. He was one of the people that founded Pixar. But before that, he was a brand new PhD from the Computer Graphics School. And his first job as a supervisor, he loved the vibe, right? He had 2 people that worked for him. They kind of saw him as one of the guys. He always knew what was going on. They invited him to drinks, to happy hour. And then the next position he had after that, he went to lead Lucasfilm's computer animation division. And obviously, that was a lot more visible. There was a lot more pressure on his shoulders, and he had a lot bigger of a team. And he noticed, sort of little by little, that he would go into a room and the conversations would stop. He noticed that he was getting mostly good news and almost no bad news. And he noticed, very visibly that he was no longer being invited to these employee events. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of those things, but what Ed discovered was I have to go far out of my way as a leader to get this feedback. And he's actually built Pixar, he and sort of his co-founders, around this idea of openness and telling the truth. And that really starts with him. And I think it's a great example of, what can we do on a daily basis? So let me give you one tool. If you think you know, you're likely wrong. Here's the tool. Loving critics. What is a loving critic? In our research, we were really surprised to learn that our unicorns were really picky about who they got feedback from. I was half expecting them to ask for feedback from, the person behind them at the grocery store or somebody they just met. And what they told us was very much the opposite. They had generally less than a handful of people who they go to for feedback. And they're positioned strategically in the areas of their life where they need feedback, so at home, at work, in the community. But the characteristics of these people were pretty consistent. Number one, the unicorns knew that they could trust them fully. So that's the loving part. They knew that they could trust them fully. Number two, though, they also were confident that this person would tell them the truth. And if you think about those two criteria, it's sort of hard to find them both in one person. And I think that's what your challenge is, not all feedback is well-intentioned, not all feedback is helpful. So to find 2 or 3 loving critics in your world who can share this honest and open feedback with you. Now, I sort of know who I'm dealing with here. I know that many of you in this room might consider yourselves, self-awareness aficionados. You say, oh my gosh, well, I do get feedback. So I wanted to give you a tool, and this is something I'm actually going to give you a code that you can text at the end of this, and I'll send you a step-by-step guide so you can do this in your team. But this is a process that was developed out of GE. Many of you have probably heard of the new assimilation or new leader assimilation exercise. Does that ring a bell? It's this idea that you get a facilitator, you get your team, you lock the team in the room with the facilitator, you put up a bunch of flip charts and get anonymous feedback from your team on how you're showing up. And that's the principle behind it. I've done this exercise for many, many, many years, and even the leaders who have done it before, every time they complete the exercise, they get something new. So even those of you that are sitting here saying, well, I do that, what I would say is, when was the last time you exchanged that feedback to really figure out how you're showing up? And in my experience, usually about once a year is a good approach to take. So that brings us to self-aware teams. We've talked about the myths, hopefully some of the solutions. We've discovered the roadblocks of self-awareness. The next thing on the plate is for you to take that to your teams. Do you know who this is? Anyone? Any car geeks? It's pretty obvious that he's with Ford. This is Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally made a career for himself by essentially saving Boeing Commercial from the 9/11 slump, and business crisis that they faced. If you've ridden a 777, he was the head of that organization, basically, that designed those aircraft. And in 2006, Ford was hurting. They weren't just hurting, they were going to lose $17 billion. So they brought in Alan Mulally, who had a track record of turnarounds. And they said, all right, let's do this. So Alan Mulally enthusiastically accepted. And in his first news conference, there were reporters everywhere, car reporters, people from the national media, obviously. And he was answering questions. And one person asked him, Mr. Mulally, what type of car do you drive? You know what he said? He said, I drive a Lexus. It's the finest car in the world. So what did that tell us? It told us that under Alan Mulally's leadership, the truth would be king. And that was his principle, something he called awareness for everyone. Self-awareness, team awareness, organizational awareness, transparency to the outside world, to government agencies, to consumers, to unions. And so that's how he led this organization. So I want to tell you about one particular activity that he engaged in that really was the beginning of Ford's turnaround. So he called these the BPR, the Business Process Review. And it was a weekly meeting with him and all of his direct reports. It was about 12 people. And they would get in a room and they would review 320 metrics that were critical for business success. And what he had them do was, if the metric was on track, it would be green. If it had potential problems, it would be yellow. If it had definite problems, it would be red. So he doled out these instructions before the first BPR. Everybody kind of came in the first day. They were all nervous. They had these big 2-inch high binders with them. And they sat down and they had their first BPR. There was just one problem. Every slide that every executive presented in this meeting was what color? Green. So we thought, well, that's strange. Maybe they need to warm up. But next week, same thing. Next week, same thing, same thing. Finally, he had had enough. So he stood up one day and he said, guys, we can't manage a secret. So we're going to lose $17 billion this year. Are you sure there isn't anything that isn't on track? Maybe just one little thing? And the executives looked at him with profound fear in their eyes. And that was Ford's culture. It was individual advancement, saving one's own self at the expense of others. And so the truth was kind of subsumed under all of that. But he said, please, just tell me the truth. More green slides. Until one day, Mark Fields, who was the president of the North American division, decided that he was going to list the product launch metric of one of his cars as red. And the reason he decided to do that was twofold. Number one, there was a rumor going around that he was going to lose his job with the new CEO. It was only a matter of time. And then he also wanted to see, is this guy for real? Is Alan Mulally really interested in hearing the truth? So imagine this BPR. You're back in the room. Green slides, green slides, green slides. Up jumps Mark Fields, and as Alan Mulally told it to me, up goes the red slide, and whoom, the air goes out of the room. And everyone's looking at their shoes. They don't know what to do. And they heard the sound that was probably the most surprising sound they could hear in that situation. It was Alan Mulally's exuberant applause. And he said, Mark, thank you. All right, what can we do to help him? And they were off and running. And Alan felt like this was a breakthrough. This was really the beginning of the turnaround. Until next week. More green slides, more green slides, more green slides. But this week, something was different. Instead of being fired, Mark Fields was being exalted. He had the prime seat next to Alan Mulally. Alan was asking his opinion. He was patting him on the back. They were shooting the breeze before the meeting. And apparently that was the proof the executives needed to bring them to the table. Now, there was a lot of hard work that was done after that, but in the way he tells it, Alan Mulally says if there was one moment in the transformation of Ford that really started us off, it was that moment when we started telling each other the truth. So they were on, forgive me, the open road to self-awareness. Everyone knows this story, don't you? In less than 5 years, Alan Mulally, under his leadership, took Ford from $17 billion of losses to $20 billion in profit. And he attributes that success, first and foremost, to awareness for everybody. Pretty powerful example. So I tell you this story really to illustrate what we've found to be the 3 building blocks of team self-awareness. And you can see each of them in the story. A leader who models the way. That was so important for him to walk the talk, to tell the truth, to hear the truth. And then there needs to be a safety amongst the team. You guys are probably familiar with all the research Google has done around this. The idea of psychological safety is one of the most important predictors of team effectiveness. And part of that is because of its influence on self-awareness. And then last but not least, you need an ongoing process to stay self-aware. Think about the times when your team has had a really good breakthrough meeting where everybody puts the issues on the table. You need to design a process to get that at every meeting. So team self-awareness is a big term. There are many facets to it. But what I want to do is give you one tool that will help you start on the path. And the tool is to help you and your team be honest about the individual contributions that each team member is making. And I call it the Team Candor Challenge. This is also something that I've been using for more than a decade. The way it works is you and your team, and ideally a facilitator, lock yourselves in a room where you proceed to give every member of that team feedback on 3 things. So each person gives feedback to each other person. Number 1, what is this person doing to help them be successful? Number 2, what one thing is this person doing that's maybe bringing down the team? And number 3, what do I need from this person to be successful? Those 3 simple questions can completely change the way teams talk to each other. But it's also not enough. You can't just do this once and say, all right, you've got to continue that process. So for Alan Mulally, the way he did that was the BPR. For each of you, it might be a different process, but the important thing is once you've sort of gotten things on track, keeping them moving. So self-aware leaders do 4 things. 4 of many, but 4 important things. Number 1, they don't assume that they already are self-aware. Number 2, they ask what, not why. Number 3, they learn the brutal truth. And number 4, they build self-aware teams. So hopefully, at least one of those things has spoken to you today. And I really encourage you to start thinking about what am I going to do differently when I walk out of the door starting today. So I want to end with a quick story. And the story illustrates that no matter where we start off, almost anyone can become more self-aware. So I want to tell you a story about a leader named Joe. And Joe was he was a brand new manager. And he had his first employee. His first employee was named Mike. Mike was bright, he was hungry, he was brilliant in his technical area of expertise. And so Joe wanted to mentor Mike and spend a lot of time with him, really shaping him and molding him into somebody that could grow, infinite amounts in his career. Which is why Joe was pretty shocked when Mike showed up one day in his office and said, "Sir, I just wanted to let you know, I quit." Joe had no idea where this came from. It was out of left field. He said, "Is there anything I can do to make you stay?" And Mike said, "No, I have got to get away from you." So Joe did the unthinkable. He invited Mike back after he resigned to sit down and give him some no-holds-barred feedback. Mike learned a lot that day, and so did Joe. What Joe learned was his approach as a leader to make his employees in his own image was sort of beyond micromanagement. It was to a point where almost nobody could be successful or engaged. And so he took that insight. He took the other insights that Mike gave him. And it started a chain of events that would end in one of the most amazing business turnarounds in US history. I changed the name. Joe is actually Alan Mulally. That was his first job ever, his first role as a leader. And his employee, quit abruptly because he was a terrible leader at the time. And the way Alan talks about this is to say, this was a gem. This was an opportunity to figure out what I could do differently and to set myself on a course for a career and a life where I focus on awareness. So I'm going to end just briefly with this quote. He says, "Throughout my career and my life, there has been one essential truth. The biggest opportunity for improvement in business, at home, and in life is awareness." I hope you've discovered that even though there might be some roadblocks that we didn't know were there, that it is possible to make this transformation. I hope I've inspired you to take or continue that journey. I hope you'll find the courage it takes to get there. And most importantly, I hope that I've helped you realize that not only is it totally worth it, it is the key skill to build on to be immensely successful in your role as learning leaders.